The existentialists called it thrownness, which is that's a Heideggerian term. And thrownness is the fact that we kind of experience life as if we're tossed into it, thrown into it. You know, you're male and not female. You're Hindu and not Christian. You're tall and not short. You have an arbitrary range of talents and an arbitrary range of limitations, none of which, in some sense, you chose. It's the cards you're dealt. Now, some of those are cards of privilege. Now, maybe you're born intelligent. Maybe you're born symmetrical. Maybe you're born healthy. Maybe you're born into a culture where it's much easier not to be absolutely deprived. Maybe your parents are rich. And so all of that, in some sense, is unearned. Now, along with that comes a good dose of existential guilt. Because at the same time, and this is true for anyone, regardless of their cultural background, the ground we walk on is soaked in the blood of historical atrocity. And so that's on you because, you know, people think, well, who's the Nazi? Well, it's the fascist, or who's the radical communist? It's the radical left-wing ideologue. And the fundamental truth of the matter is that's best dealt with as a spiritual matter, is the adversary is within, really, most profoundly. And so you have to take the responsibility for that historical atrocity onto yourself. I was talking to Guy Ritchie this week about his movie King Arthur. It's quite an interesting movie in many ways. And when Arthur, who could be the hero, takes the sword, he's so overcome by visions of his murderous uncle that he can't pick up the weapon. Well, think about that. Now, you have weapons at your disposal, but they've been used by your murderous uncle. How dare you wield them? And the answer is, maybe it's easy just to leave the sword on the ground because you do want to be responsible for atrocities going forward. And don't think you couldn't be. And don't think you might not enjoy it. And so, the way you pay for your privilege is with your virtue. I mean that most particularly. You have these opportunities and this existential guilt. And the way you expiate that and atone is by doing your best to live the best possible life you can manage, to speak the truth, to treat people with respect, to abide by the principles of the dignity of the individual, and to put your house in order. And that's how you pay for your unearned privilege. All of us. And we all have our privileges and our curses, you know. All of us have that. That's why it's not useful to be envious of people. You know, you're a young man, you see someone drive by in a Ferrari with a blonde, and you think, my God, he's got everything. And, you know, the woman in the car is a prostitute who's got a cocaine addiction, and her life is just one catastrophe after another. And he's had to lie and cheat his way into this position, and he's afraid that everything's going to come crashing down on him, and that's what you're jealous of. And it's just not that profound. You don't want someone else's fate. Man, your fate's enough, and your adventure's enough. It's plenty. It's more than you can ever fully realize. And so that's also part of the reason that we all believe that the individual has some intrinsic dignity. It's don't be so sure that your position and your room is so damn trivial. It might be your attitude towards it that's trivial. And if you're in dire straits and dire circumstances, just look at how much opportunity you have to make things better. We're built to walk uphill. And when you reach the pinnacle of the hill, you want to stop and appreciate the vision, but the next thing you want is a higher hill in the distance, because it's the uphill climb that it's from the uphill climb that we derive our value. And I mean this technically. So almost all the positive emotion we feel, especially the emotion that fills us with enthusiasm, and that's to be filled with the Spirit of God, by the way, because that's what enthusiasm means. That's experienced in relationship to a goal. And so in some sense, and this is part of the religious enterprise, you want a goal that you can never attain, right? So you can always move closer to the goal that recedes as you move towards it. You think, well, that's frustrating. It's like Sisyphus pushing the rock uphill. But it's not, because as you pursue that goal, you put yourself together and your life does get better and richer and more abundant. And that's why the highest levels of virtue and goal are in some sense transcendent. You want them to be above everything you're doing so you can continually move towards something that's more sublime and better. That's what you are. You're here to live, not to sleep. And the problem with the vision of Mai Tais on the beach is that, well, first of all, that's a vision of drug-induced unconsciousness. Second, it's only going to work for about a week. Third, you're going to be a laughingstock in a month and depressed and aimless and goalless. You want a horizon of ever expanding possibility. And so it does happen to people because they've staked their soul on the attainment of an instrumental goal. And it can be a pretty high order goal. It was in your case. But then you think, well, now I'm there. Now what? Well, the answer can't be, well, I'm going to live in the lap of luxury and never have to leave the face. What do you want to be? A giant infant with a gold bottle? You never have to do anything but lay in your back and suck. It's like, well, you see the problem with that as a conceptualization. It's no, you want to be like an active warrior moving uphill with your sword in hand. And that's dynamic. That's exciting. And that's why so many young men disappear into video games. That's all acted out in the video game. So they have to act that out in their own life.
We asked that question with good intentions. Mm-hmm. Are you happy? What's a better question for me to ask Jordan Peterson?
How are you doing?
How are you doing? How are you doing?
Brilliantly and terribly. You know, when you listen to a profound piece of music, one that sort of spans the whole emotional experience, it's not happy. Happy is elevator music, and probably you just shouldn't listen to that at all. Right? And you think, why? Well, it's harmless, it's treacly, it's sweet, it's simple, it lacks depth, it's shallow, that's a problem. It doesn't have that deep sense of awe and horror, I would say, that is characteristic of the best of all music. You know, you listen to some simple music, so-called. Hank Williams is a good example. You know, the blues cowboy from the 50s who died of alcoholism when he was 27 and whose voice sounds like an 80-year-old man. Simple melody, you know, but there's nothing simple in the song and in the voice. It's deep, you know, it's like the blues. It's like black blues in the States from the 20s, and it was certainly influenced by that tradition. There's this admission of a deep suffering at the same time as you get the beautiful transcendence of the music. And that's meaning, you know, that's awful in the most fundamental sense, but you need an antidote to suffering, and it has to be deep. And you know, deep moves you tectonically, and it's not a trivial thing. But that's better than happiness. And maybe if you're lucky, while you're pursuing that and while you're immersed in it, you get to be happy, and you should fall on your knees and be grateful for that when it happens. You know, it's a gift. It really is a gift. And it comes upon you unexpectedly, your happiness, you know. But you aim to climb uphill to the highest peak you can possibly envision. And that's better than happiness.
Why did you include terribly?
Well, for example, now when I go, wherever I go in the world, people come up to me and they're usually, I wouldn't say they're happy to see me. They're often in tears, you know, and they often have a pretty rough story to relate. You know, they were suicidal or nihilistic or homicidal or trapped, desperate, you know, and they tell me that real fast. And then they say, I've overcome that to a large degree, and thank you for that. And you think, well, that's really something to have that happen over and over. In some ways, you might think, well, how could anything better possibly happen to you than to have people come up to you all over the world, strangers, and open themselves up like that, like they're old friends so quickly. But at the same time, it's an awful thing, because you see, even in the revelation of their triumph, the initial depth of their despair. So I wouldn't change that. But it's not nothing. It's certainly not just happiness. It's better than happiness, but it's almost unbearable.
If you're not doing what you want to do or what you think you should be doing, drop the presumption that you know who you are and start to negotiate with yourself like you're a stranger who needs to be enticed forward. Because you don't know who you are, especially if you're not able to regulate your behavior, because that's evidence that you don't know who you are. Something is driving the ship. It's not you, or it's not the you think you are. And that's often extremely humiliating to people, because you may have to pick a goal that's so low, so lowly, right, that you embarrass yourself half to death by recognizing the necessity of you having to practice that. But the upside of that is that improvement, incremental improvement, scales exponentially. So even if you have to start somewhere really trivially, man, once you start, you can really scale up quickly. And so, and with an exponential increase, which I think improvement is, the trajectory of improvement is characterized by a power law function. It doesn't really matter where you start if you're doubling. Look, think you get 1% better a week. That's not that high a goal, right? Maybe you could get rid of 1% of your stupidity and malevolence a week, or maybe every 2 weeks. Because that compounds, in 3 years, you are a completely different person. And it doesn't end there. So even if you're starting with, the horrible mixed bag of catastrophes that you actually are, if you're diligent in your attempts to rectify your errors and to aim higher, man. And then with regards to your goals, let's say you don't know what to do. Well, maybe you're high in openness, and so you're pulled in all sorts of directions, or maybe you're low in conscientiousness, or you're confused because you're anxious, or you haven't had any direction, you haven't had good mentoring, etc., etc. There's lots of reasons. Well, I would say, pick something, right? Pick something, a nameable goal, and then try to implement it. And what'll happen is, you'll learn a lot by trying to implement it. And one of the things you might learn is what a slightly better goal might be. Because if you try something diligently and you succeed or you fail, you're going to learn from the effort expended in the detailed implementation of the goal is going to inform you. It'll also transform you physiologically. It does that at a very basic level, neurophysiological level. You will be slightly different as a consequence of the attempt. And what that'll mean is that the next goal you pick will be a little more suited to you. And so it's this kind of pathway, right? It's like maybe the goal you should be attaining is here, but you don't know that because you're clueless. And so you aim there. Well, it's better than there. And it's not nothing. It's not cessation of movement. And, if you're supposed to go there and you go here, but you walk diligently towards it, you're a little closer once you get to here than you were here. And it's this oscillating self-corrective process that leads you to the final star. And you have to be willing to engage in erroneous experimentation to manage that. But it is a self-correcting process. And so one of the things I always talk to my clients about is, well, let's try something, and we'll reserve to ourselves the right to alter our trajectory. And then I would use as a corrective there, because you might say, well, how do you know when you're not just giving up, right? Instead of thinking maybe you need a different goal. And I would say, well, you can, if you're really concerned about your proclivity for self-deception, you can enter into a contract with yourself that you won't replace any goal you've set with a goal that's easier. And so you can switch your goal, but it has to be a little harder so that you check yourself against that tendency to withdraw and avoid and be self-deceptive. And that works like a charm. And if you do that with some degree of diligence, your goals will get better and more attainable, and you'll get happier too, because you don't experience happiness except in relationship to a goal. your life is meaningless, well, you're not pursuing a valued goal. I mean, you might be depressed too, and sometimes that can be like an illness, or something that is really wrong with you. But a good rule of thumb is that if you find no joy in life, there's a very low probability that you're pursuing a goal that you regard intrinsically, like in the depths of your temperament, as worthwhile. And that's technically true because we do in fact experience most of the positive emotion, let's say, that's associated with emotions like joy. We experience that in relationship to a goal. So, well, then you want to find a goal that regulates your negative emotion and that brings you a certain amount of positive emotion and that expands your competence as you pursue it. And you will experience that as meaningful. That's really what meaning signals. Meaning signals you're doing all those things. You say, well, that's not real. It's like, don't listen to the semantic chatterbox so much, right? There's levels of you that are far wiser than that. And you can watch what happens to you instead of noticing what you think, and that's another thing I always did with my clients, especially if they're depressed. It's like, well, let's watch you for a week and let's see when you're not so depressed. What are you doing when you're not so depressed? Now, for some people who had an endogenous depression, they were just depressed all the time. And sometimes an antidepressant was a good solution to that. But for people who were situationally depressed, which is equally common, let's say, there'd be quite a bit of variation in their mood. And say, well, it turns out that I'm not so depressed when I'm with so-and-so. It's like, okay, well, why? And more importantly, how can we do more of that? And when were you more depressed? Well, when I'm alone in my room, brooding. Okay, well, how about you spend 10% less time this week alone in your room? Like, we'll introduce 10%, let's say. So you're awake for 16 hours, so that's an hour. Now we'd probably go for 5%, half an hour. That's a hell of an improvement over 20 weeks, right? Because that would be 100% less time doing counterproductive brooding.
I'm really on the side of the person that wants to do something positive with their life, to make their own life better, because I think that's where you should start. You should start by maximizing the quality of your own life. That's not a selfish thing, or if it is, it's the right kind of selfishness. And that you should figure out how to do that in a way that's of benefit to your friends and your family and your community, and you should take that deadly seriously. And the reason you should do that is because that just makes life better for everyone. And it reduces a fair bit of the misery that would otherwise be part and parcel of life, and it makes everything function smoothly. And one of the things I'm really curious about is what the world would be like if everybody decided to do that, because human beings are really remarkable creatures, and we hobble ourselves very badly with deception and resentment and revenge and the desire to make things worse and arrogance and all those sins, let's say, that make us deviate from our true path. And our true path should be something like, imagine the noblest aim that you can conceptualize and then sacrifice your life to attempting to attain it. And there's nothing in that isn't good for everyone. And so, apart from the fact that it requires a lot of responsibility, I just can't see why everyone wouldn't do that. And when I'm talking to young people and, shaking my finger and saying, grow the hell up and get mature and take on some responsibility, I'm not saying that because I'm an enemy of the person. I'm saying it because I'm the best friend of the part of them that would really like to walk in the light. And it's an invitation to walk in the light. And it would be remarkable. This is what we need to do, as far as I'm concerned, not only in the West, but in the world at large, but maybe in the West first, is we have to consciously decide that we're going to do everything we can as individuals to walk in the light, and to regard that as a noble and heroic endeavor, and to make that first and foremost in our lives. And that's what we should be educating young people to do, and they can do that. And so I have dozens of people writing to me and talking to me all the time who are saying the same thing. They're saying, look, I've really been trying to get my act together over the last 6 months. I've been trying not to lie, which is slightly different than trying to tell the truth, right? It's a more humble goal to not lie, because you can tell when you're lying, but you can't necessarily tell when you're telling the truth. And I've been coming up with a plan, and I've been trying to discipline myself, and I've been cleaning up my room, which is like a nice humble act that involves transforming chaos into order. And they write and say, God, things are just working out way better for me. It's like, whoa, do it, man. That's just, you keep that up for 15 years and you'll be unbeatable. And that's what we should be convincing young people to be is to be unbeatable.
Cooperate with your wife and negotiate. And don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. Because if you dislike them, you can bloody well be sure other people will. And you can guide them, and part of that's that acceptant maternal love that sort of encompasses everything. Some of that's the discriminating encouragement that fosters further growth, and you want a balance of that in your household. And then you can have love and joy and play, and that's little walled garden. That's paradise where people play forever, happily. So, aim up, tell the truth, negotiate with your wife, shed your resentment, and love and encourage your children.
Try to do as much good possible as efficiently as possible. And that efficiency thing is really fun. If you guys who are listening are out for a challenge, like one of the things that you can, I think this heightens the meaning in your life, is to try to do difficult things, right? Aim high. Don't aim so damn high you can't manage it, and make sure you break down your aims into reasonably attainable sub-goals, but you want to aim high, and then you want to see how hyper efficient you can get. That's a great thing to do in your early 20s. Is to see, okay, like discipline yourself. You think, okay, how much work can I do if I load myself right to the maximum? How far can I work? How hard can I work until I exhaust myself? And then you back off, obviously, because the optimal amount of working, productive engagement, let's say, is that which is sustainable across decades. So you have to learn that, but you don't learn that without stretching yourself to your limits to begin with. And if your life isn't everything it could be, and if you're suffering from an excess of meaninglessness, well, it means you're not oriented in the world of chaos and order properly. It's like you could learn to discipline yourself. Figure out what it is that you need to do and that you want to do, and then see how efficient you can get. Because one of the things that's quite fun is to figure out, if you have a task, I always tell my graduate students this, if they're doing an experiment too, if you have a task that you have to do, it's really interesting to spend a few minutes, sometimes hours, depending on how long the task is, see if you can figure out how to do it from 5 to 10 times faster. It means you'll have to rearrange the way you think about it, but you can often do it. And that's how extremely productive people get so hyper efficient. Sometimes it means you have to delegate. Sometimes it means you have to bring other people aboard. That's delegation as well, I suppose. But there's a lot of preconceptions that you hold about who you are and who the world is that you could dispense with, that would make you a way more efficient actor in the world. Ask yourself what would motivate you. First of all, don't be studying 8 hours a day, because that isn't going to work and you're not going to do it anyways. Would you start studying 5 minutes a day? Seriously, could you bring it up to 10 minutes a day? What would you have to do for yourself to get yourself to sit down for half an hour a day and study intently? Like maybe you'd have to, I don't know what you'd have to do, like have a beer at 6 o'clock at night or something, or maybe you'd have to go for a walk in the park or go out for coffee. It's like, imagine that you're sitting down with a stupid, undisciplined child and you're trying to get that child to do something useful. And you say, okay, look, I want you to do X, it's necessary, but you can pick how much of it you're going to do, and I'll give you what you want if you do it. Well, ask yourself that and see what happens. So don't try to tyrannize yourself, try to negotiate with yourself and use some reward and see how that works. And start slow, maybe you're not very disciplined and the best you can do is half an hour of studying it a day. Well, start with half an hour. Increase that 5 minutes a week. If you do that, that's a lot. If you do that for a year, then by the end of the year you'll be studying 4 hours a day. So you can that's just with 5 minutes a week, right? Because that's 250 minutes in a year. So start ridiculously, pathetically. Study for 5 minutes a day for a week, and then move it to 10. You'll be able to do that. And don't cheat, because one of the things people do is they make a deal with themselves like that. I'm going to study for 10 minutes a day, each day. And then they get into it and they think, wow, this is going really good. So they study for 2 hours, and then they've broken the contract with themselves and they don't trust themselves anymore. And then they don't study for a whole year. Or, well, maybe not. For a month. So, but set your contract. Ask yourself, what could I do to move myself forward to my goal that I would do? And then how could I improve that incrementally? You can't exist outside of a framework of value. It's not possible. It's not technically possible. I outlined this in quite a bit of detail in chapter 10, which is called Rule 10, which is called be precise in your speech, is that the way the world manifests itself to you is integrally tied to your value structure. And that's because, to put it very simply, is that your very vision is dependent on an aim. Like whenever you look at the world, you're aiming at something. You're aiming at something with your eyes. You can't focus on something without aiming at it, and you won't aim at it without valuing it. So your very perceptions are dependent on your value structure. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't a world. It does mean that experience is a complex interplay of your value structure and the unmanifest world. It's something like that. And then that begs the question, which is, well, if you have to have a value structure, then what should it be? Well, and then that brings us back to the ideas that we were talking about earlier. Like you should value being. You should take on the responsibility of being as your highest ethical obligation and try to improve it, try to reduce suffering, try to make the most out of yourself in a way that's beneficial to you and your family and your community. You should aim high, and your perceptions will reconfigure themselves around those aims, and that will allow the world to manifest itself to you in the most positive possible manner, or at least in the most meaningful possible manner. And in the absence of that, all you have is stupid suffering. That is the anxiety and depression that we talked about earlier. Without a point, without value, without an aim, all you're left with is the misery and anxiety of life. That makes people bitter.
I love to bring up the notion of the aim, because one can react to this stupid suffering in a number of ways, but this is so clear. You write in it, you say, you cannot aim yourself at anything if you are completely undisciplined and untutored. You will not know what to target. You won't fly straight, even if you do get your aim right. And then you will conclude there is nothing to aim for, and then you will be lost. And these days, the prevailing moral framework, as I see it, is if it feels good, do it. How is it that discipline and the straight and narrow offer the best chance for a good life? And how is it that we have forgotten that is the case?
Well, the reason that discipline is necessary is because you're a mass of competing short-term interests. And so the question is then, well, which short-term interests should win out? And the answer to that is, well, none of them. They need to be organized into a hierarchy that makes them functional across time and across individuals. So like a 2-year-old is very likely to act out his or her proximal impulse. But of course, a 2-year-old can't survive in the world. You have to bring your primary instincts, let's say, under the regulatory structure of a higher order value system that allows them to manifest themselves without undue mutual sacrifice across large spans of time in the presence of large numbers of other people. So that requires a very sophisticated ordering. It's like, we already talked about the fact that a meta-narrative is necessary to unite subcultures, say, so that they can operate peacefully and harmoniously within the same space. The same thing applies within you, because you're an internal coalition of warring, single-minded tribes, and they have to all be brought under the organizational structure of long-term collective vision, let's say. And in order to do that, you have to be disciplined. And any discipline, technically speaking, is an attempt to bring all those competing short-term impulses under a larger scale and more inclusive framework. And so you do that, and then, well, that's actually what gives you freedom. Being impulsive and being free aren't the same things, because if you're impulsive, you're just the slave of your impulses.
Right.
There's no freedom in that. That's the same freedom, so to speak, literally, that a 2-year-old has, because a 2-year-old isn't socialized yet. So it's a completely, that doesn't function in the sophisticated world. It doesn't work.
Right.
Everyone knows it.
We just like to pretend sometimes to say, oh, that does feel good, you know. Now, I have one last...
Well, we like to pretend all the time, because that's why we go out and drink, you know, because drinking enables you to blind yourself to the long-term consequences of your actions. And there's no doubt that that's very, very rewarding in the short term. But it's also why you wake up the next morning hungover and ashamed.
Where do you find the hope and the strength to continue to fight, or for those who are listening, to get the motivation to stand up and say what's on their mind?
Well, people have to have a dialogue with their own conscience. You know, if you don't, imagine that you get upset with something when you recognize an obstacle in your path, and then imagine that you need a path and that you've chosen reasonably wisely, let's say, not perfectly, but reasonably wisely. An obstacle arises, you're frustrated, disappointed, ashamed, afraid. Well, you have something to do to clear out the obstacle. You have something to say. Well, then you don't clear out the obstacle because you're afraid to speak, or you're unwilling to speak. You want to defer the conflict because you hope it will go away. All that'll happen is that the obstacles will pile up. But then your life will be nothing but obstacles. Well, you need to know that. You have to ask yourself if you believe that's true. If it's true, then you don't want to remain silent. Imagine too that as you remain silent, you get smaller because you're not manifesting the courage necessary to live by your own standards. And the problem gets bigger. Well, if you're not going to speak now, what makes you think you're going to be more prepared in the future?
You won't.
Why is that going to happen? When does that ever happen?
Well, I can't believe we're talking about school. People who say, just stay quiet in school, just get the grade. That's paying
wrong.
them.
That's wrong.
That's right. You're paying them. You don't have the courage when you're paying. When somebody's paying you and they're doing something at work and they want you to play along, you think you're going to have courage then? I mean, you've got to face it as it happens.
I told my students all the time to never write something they didn't believe to be true. And I know this as a psychologist too. You know, you might think, I can get away with writing out something I don't believe for the grade, but there are studies of this sort of phenomenon. So imagine you have a viewpoint, and I measure that with a political attitudes questionnaire. Okay, maybe it's a viewpoint. What do we take? You're anti-immigration, just for the sake of argument. And then I ask you to write out a 500-word pro-immigration essay. And then a week later, I give you the political questionnaire again. Now, I'm going to bury it in a bunch of other questionnaires, so you don't know what I'm measuring. Okay, Your belief has tilted way towards the argument that you've made, even though you don't know it. So, and it's because most of your beliefs are actually rather shallow in terms of their explicit formulation. You think you believe something, but it's pretty shallow. It's just an assumption. Now, you might act on it and all of that, but it's not well differentiated and articulated. Now, if you take one of your assumptions and you write a counterexample, you're going to articulate that. Well, then that's going to move you. And so if you think that you can write an essay that you don't believe and you'll remain unscathed by that, well, you're wrong. You won't. And if you do it 20 times, you will turn into what you wrote. That's what will happen. And it's an absolute sin in my estimation. I mean that specifically for anyone who attends university to write what they do not believe to be true. It's certainly a sin for anyone to encourage them to do that. Now, you can do that as an exercise. You can ask people to delineate out an argument that runs contrary to their viewpoint. That can be part of the reasonable process of learning.
Correct.
But that is not the same thing as doing it for deceptive purposes to manipulate your professor because you're too cowardly to formulate your arguments properly. In chapter 11 of Beyond Order, this new book that you've been referring to, I tried to delineate out sources of tragedy. and malevolence for that matter, but we can start with tragedy, because you need a theory of tragedy, because otherwise you tend to blame simplistically. Okay, so we could walk through it very quickly. You just talked about one particular kind of tragedy, which is natural. It's like you can do everything right and nature can take you out at the knees, right?
Yep.
Okay, so that's one source of suffering in life, the natural world. Another source of suffering is the inadequacy of our social institutions. And a third source of tragedy is our inadequacy as individuals. And malevolence doesn't apply particularly to the natural world, although it can feel like that at times if someone
Yes.
you love is afflicted by some terrible disease, for
Right.
example. And we tend to think of that as particularly malevolent when we admire the moral stature of the person so affected, right?
Correct.
But it's somewhat unfair to attribute malevolence to nature. It's more fair to attribute it to social structures. And it's more fair to attribute it to the darkness in our own souls. But you need to know, I think you need to have a sophisticated representation of tragedy and malevolence so that you don't fall prey to simplistic blaming. So human suffering is not caused by capitalism. That's wrong. Now you could say there are elements of human suffering that are exaggerated by excesses and defaults in capitalism. That's a different statement. That's not a black and white statement. It's a reasonable statement. You can progress from there. But you should say perhaps at the same time that for all its faults, this is the good that it's done, and it isn't obvious what system would work better. So now the question, I suppose part of the question is, why do we fall prey to more simplistic forms of reasoning? And some of that is, well, it's convenient. It's easy and convenient. It's easy because it's easier to think in black and white terms to just attribute malevolence. So, for example, if you believe that all human suffering is a consequence of capitalism, that solves a lot of problems for you. You know where malevolence is. You know what your moral duty is. You've simplified the world. You've taken a huge burden off your shoulders, and you certainly don't have to take on the moral requirement of participating in the system, and perhaps you don't want to, and God only knows why that might be. You want this more nuanced approach, and that was actually part of the purpose of a classical education. A humanities education was designed to give you a more nuanced view. That was its original purpose, although that's, sadly, I would say, gone by the wayside. It looks like it. I've had these conversations recently that have been quite interesting, they're very disturbing, actually. I talked to two of Canada's most outstanding people in the last 2 weeks, Conrad Black, who ran a huge newspaper empire, and Rex Murphy, who's probably Canada's best known journalist personality, because he's both. He's a great journalist, but he's a personality as well. And they remembered their university education. Jocko Willink as well. He's not a Canadian, but he had the same kind of memory. They talked about their education in the humanities, mostly concentrating on English literature, and described it with tremendous fondness as a turning point in their life, as an opening up of the world of knowledge to their youthful eyes, right? Very, very fondly. Contrasted that with Yeonmi Park, who is an escapee from North Korea, very brave woman who was then enslaved in China, had a life that was just sheer hell, and spent a good part of the interview telling me how much better her life was than the lives of many people she knew. She wrote a book called In Order to Live, but the book stopped at the year 2015, so I asked her what she did. She went to Columbia, took a humanities degree, which was a dream of hers. After finishing her entire education in 1 year, her education prior to university.
Cow.
Right, exactly. Then she went to a South Korean university for 3 years. They're hard to get into. And then she went to Columbia. I said, what was it like going to Columbia? Taking a humanities degree from this escapee from totalitarianism who was once enslaved, got to go to one of America's august institutions and be trained in the humanities. Someone who'd been exposed to George Orwell and who was motivated to write because she read Animal Farm, understood the power of literature. She said it was a complete waste of time and money, and that she was afraid to say anything.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. It's a hell of a thing to hear when you're a university professor. If someone has
said rude things to you, for example, says a rude thing to you, maybe you shouldn't respond immediately even though you're very irritated, because maybe that's just an impulsive response and one that you'll regret, one you make in anger that you'll regret. And so I would say, when you're dealing with someone and you want to chastise them, then you should wait for them to sin 3 times, right? So the first time they're rude to you, you think, oh, well, they're probably having a bad day, or I misunderstood, or I'm rude sometimes too, and I'll just let it go. But you don't forget, and you don't pretend it didn't happen, and then it happens again, and you think, well, that could still be fluke, that could still be situational, so maybe I'll just hold my damn tongue, but I'll remember that, and then the third time they do it, then you think, no, 3 times, that's a pattern. And so then you can go to them and you can say, look, this happened, and then maybe they deny it, and you say, well, yeah, you can deny it, but then this happened, and maybe they deny it, and you can say, well, you can deny that, but then this happened. And 3 times the charm. And that's a time when you should stand up for yourself and say what you have to say. Look, you have to put yourself in a position where you can say what you have to say. You have to think it through. You have to have a plan. And you can't just launch yourself off the edge of a cliff and hope that God's going to catch you on the way down. And it's definitely the case that if you have something to say, like if you're being oppressed at work, if you've got some, horrible tyrant as a boss, or maybe that's happening to you in your marriage, or maybe you're the horrible tyrant, God only knows. There's things that have to be said, but that doesn't mean you can just blurt them out. You have to have a plan. You have to figure out what you want to say. You have to make it as minimally troublesome as possible. You have to have the goal that you want in mind, and you have to have a backup plan. Like this, the sort of thing that you're talking about, where you need to say something. That's like a little war. You don't want to walk into that unarmed and unprepared. Now that doesn't mean that you should, that means that you should set up your life so that you're firmly enough anchored in a variety of different ways so that you can say what you need to say. My hierarchy would be something like this. I type letters, I type words, phrases, sentences, paragraphs. I sequence the paragraphs, I make chapters, I write books. It's all coherently laid out towards some higher order aim, all of that. And the aim is, as far as I'm concerned, to share my clinical knowledge and to educate people. And that makes sense because I'm a clinician and a researcher and a professor. And so if I was going to do that, I've decided I'm going to do that. So that's what I'm doing. And hopefully that's a good thing. And hopefully people respond to it as if it's a good thing, because then that's a good thing for me and it's a good thing for them. And so that seems to be like the very definition of a good thing. And I'm trying to set things straight, right? I'm trying to set myself straight by writing carefully. I'm trying to set the culture straight by saying what I believe to be the case. I'm trying to set other individuals straighter by communicating with them. I'm trying to ensure that we can live more harmoniously in our culture and in the world. And you think, well, those are good things to have at the outermost reaches of your value hierarchy. My friend of mine was talking to me about bricklayers the other day, and he's trying to restructure a major company at the moment. And we were talking about how to motivate people. He said, well, let's say you're a bricklayer. It's like, one damn brick after another. How are you going to be excited about that? Well, let's say you're a medieval bricklayer, right? And it's 1500, and you're working in one of the great working in one of the great early Renaissance cities in Europe. And it isn't a wall you're building, it's a cathedral. It's going to take 350 years. And why are you doing that? Well, it's for the ultimate glory of God, whatever that means. And so you're not putting one brick down after another. It's like you're involved in this unbelievably complicated moral structure that stretches all the way up to heaven itself, so to speak. And each of your minor actions, your local actions, is imbued with the spirit of that entire moral structure. Well, that's a philosophy. It's like, well, do you have a meaning in life? What's the meaning of life? Well, hopefully it isn't just unrequited suffering and malevolence. We could dispense with that as much as possible. That might be a good start. But then to aim high, well, that seems to be reasonable. To aim as high as you can. And we've laid out things that
could be aimed at. You could constrain yourself, There are things you're not doing and things that you shouldn't be doing. You stop doing the things that you shouldn't be doing and start doing the things you should be doing. That's a good start. Wake up enough so that you can set the structures around you right. It's your moral obligation as a citizen, your responsibility, and your divine duty, I would say, from our cultural perspective, because in the West, everyone is regarded as a sovereign individual. The fate of the state, a sovereign individual on whose shoulders rests the fate and the health of the state, right? That's the fundamental presupposition. Otherwise, well, why do you get to vote? Just to make a mistake? Well, no, that's not it. You're supposed to be awake so that the ship of state continues to move forward in the appropriate direction. And somehow we've decided that's up to you. Why? Well, because we've also decided, hey man, you can do it. And not only that, no one else can. And so that's something to know and might be something to take seriously. It's like, who knows what the hell you'd be if you got your act together. Be a force to contend with, You'd have constrained the malevolence in your own soul, and you'd have started to take advantage of the potential that's around you and to build yourself out of that potential into God only knows what, And then maybe with that wisdom you can set the structures around you in order, at least more in order than they are, or maybe to disintegrate them a bit when they need it and to restructure them so they're even better than they are. And you can push back nature in its horrible form and invite it forward in its positive form and make things better for you and for your family and for your community. And you can approach the unknown itself and you can explore the potential that's out there. And you can bring back the treasure that's part of the unknown potential. And you can distribute that. And that is what you can do. And then not only that's what you need to do, because you need to have a meaning in your life, an aim, a value structure that's of sufficient potency and magnitude to justify the limitations and the trouble that life constitutes, right? This is no trivial business that we're involved in, right? We're all in this up to our necks, literally. It's a mortal game. You're all in. And to play it wrong is to risk suffering in hell. And I'm not talking about afterlife. I'm not talking about something metaphysical. You can generate plenty of hell right here around you. Plenty. An unlimited amount. And so you can move towards that direction, or you can move towards a positive direction. And you can orient yourself. And you can learn. This is why the postmodernists are so incorrect. It's like, look, you need an aim. You need an aim. You cannot organize the way you look at the world without an aim. It's not optional. And then the question is, well, what should the aim be? Well, probably not to radically increase the amount of misery and suffering that you experience in everyone else. I mean, maybe you want to go that route, and people do, but I think they only do when they become bitter and they give up, and they make mistakes they know they're making, right? It's conscious decision to go down that route. It's not like they think that's okay to begin with. Their aim's wrong. It's like, straighten out your aim. So there's an old idea, this idea of sin. Sin is a word that was derived from a Greek word, hamartia. And hamartia is an archery term, and it means to miss the target. And so you think, well, how can you miss the target? Well, you have no weapon. Well, then you miss the target. You have no target. You have no aim. Well, then you miss the target. You don't pick up your bow. Well, then you miss the target. You don't draw it back. Then you miss the target. You don't practice and miss many times, right? Because you have to do that to develop the skill to hit the target. So you're not willing to take the risk to miss. You do none of that. And so you miss the target. And that's the sin. And then you miss your life. And then what happens around you is that, well, there's far more hell than there has to be, and there's much less heaven than there could be. And it's on you. And that's part of your, what would you say, your divine value, let's say, that sets you aside along with everyone else as something someone, some being that even the law itself has to respect intrinsically, and that's marked out in our culture by the sovereignty that you possess, and the notion that there's something in you that's made in the image of God, something that can confront the unknown and to create habitable order out of chaos and potential, and to do that properly. And that's all true as far as I can tell. And it's all necessary to know. It's coded in the deepest stories that are at the base of our culture. And we're in danger of not understanding them and not believing them. And it's a big mistake, because they're heavy and profound and weighty and fundamental and necessary, because you have to stand on something that's solid, or everything is sand and you fall in and you're done. And so is everything around you. You can't look at the world without an aim. Literally. You can't even perceive it. You cannot regulate your emotions without an aim. The better your aim, the more precise your aim, the more elevated your aim. You remember in Pinocchio, when Geppetto wants to turn Pinocchio into a real boy, he wishes on a star. It's a strange thing, eh? But everybody just accepts it. It's like, well, yeah, if you've got a puppet, you just made a puppet, and you want to turn it into a boy, the logical thing to do is open the window and wish on a star. Everyone knows that. It's like, none of that makes the least bit of sense, obviously, except metaphorically, but we do understand it because we can watch that, and it makes sense. There's something magical about it. And there is something magical about it. Because the truth of the matter is that if you want to transform something that's nothing but a wooden-headed puppet into something that's a fully functional, autonomous, moral, autonomous individual, then what you do is you elevate your eyes above the horizon to the highest point of light that you can perceive, and you aim at that. And that works. And that works for you, and it works for your partner, and it works for your children, and it works for the world.
with you I don't ever feel calm. I can feel the sweat inside my palms. Play with me like cats and a string. You don't understand the pain it brings. You don't ever wanna give me wings. You don't ever wanna set me free. You know I'm addicted to you, and it's twisted, you've been gifted with the evil voodoo. Got me coming back for more, even when I've been screwed. Dolls full of pins, pierce my heart straight through. I got issues in my head, I like you in my bed, but you keep me on red. Oh, everything is like a test, I better not text or I'll come off desperate.
But if I lay down and I play dead and I stay dead, baby you'll get sick of being the monster out of my head, under my bed, thinking something out of my nightmares, standing right there. But if I lay down and I play dead and I stay dead, then will you get bored of killing?
So if I play dead, will you regret everything that you did, that you said? I don't think you understand what you're doing, and my heart's black and blue from the bruising. I feel like when I'm with you I'm losing. I feel like you think that this amusing, sitting there gaslighting and confusing. Was it me? Is it me? Am I deluded? I'm the one who's always sorry, the conclusion. Even though I offer all of the solutions, I wish you